Rocket Lab, from Kiwi dream to space reality. Shacklenature. Picture this, a scrappy New Zealand startup founded by a college dropout who once strapped a rocket engine to a bicycle is now worth $11 billion and has completed 63 orbital launches. While Elon Musk's SpaceX dominates headlines with Starship and Mars ambitions, Rocket Lab has quietly become the second most frequent orbital launcher among Western companies. They've built an end-to-end space company, designing rockets, manufacturing satellites, creating spacecraft components, and developing mission software, all while operating from a sheep farm on New Zealand's North Island. The numbers tell a remarkable story. Since their first successful orbital launch in 2018, Rocket Lab has deployed over 190 satellites, captured rocket boosters midair with helicopters, and secured contracts with NASA, the U.S. Space Force, and commercial giants. They're not just launching rockets, they're building the entire space infrastructure stack, from the vehicle that gets you to orbit to the spacecraft systems that operate once you're there. But here's the central question that defines everything. In an industry where SpaceX seems to have won before the game even started, can Peter Beck's David truly compete with Elon's Goliath? Or perhaps more intriguingly, does Rocket Lab even need to compete directly to win? The story we're about to tell isn't just about rockets and satellites. It's about how a kid from Invercargill, New Zealand's southernmost city, closer to Antarctica than to Australia, built a space company through sheer determination, clever engineering, and the audacity to think differently. It's about finding profitable niches in a market everyone assumed was winner take all. And it's about the next chapter, a $2 billion bet on a medium-lift rocket called Neutron that will determine whether Rocket Lab becomes a footnote or a cornerstone in humanity's expansion beyond Earth. What makes this story particularly compelling for investors is the timing. We're at an inflection point where Rocket Lab has proven it can execute in small launch, but hasn't yet demonstrated it can scale to compete in the lucrative medium-lift market. The stock has surged 485% in the past year, yet the company still burns cash while racing to complete Neutron before competitive windows close. It's a high-stakes moment that echoes Tesla in 2017 or Amazon in 2001. Proven vision, demonstrated capability, but everything hanging on successful execution of the next big bet. The year was 2006, and Peter Beck was running out of options. The New Zealand rocket enthusiast had traveled halfway around the world to the United States, carrying a portfolio of photographs showcasing his homemade rocket contraptions, a rocket-powered bicycle that could hit 90 miles per hour, a jetpack, various experimental engines. He'd built a steam-powered rocket bicycle that traveled nearly 90 mph. He thought these credentials might open doors at NASA, Boeing, or one of the American aerospace giants. Instead, security guards escorted him off the premises. On the face of it, here's a foreign national turning up to an Air Force base asking a whole bunch of questions about rockets. That doesn't look good, Beck would later recall. The rejection stung, but something profound happened during that trip. He learned that few companies were actually building what he wanted to build, lightweight suborbital rockets to transport small satellites. On the long flight back to New Zealand, while most passengers slept, Beck sketched a logo on an airline napkin. On the flight back to New Zealand, he plotted his future startup, even drawing a logo on a napkin. That napkin sketch would become the foundation of an $11 billion space company. To understand how a college dropout from New Zealand's southernmost city built one of the world's most successful rocket companies, you have to start in Invercargill. Beck grew up in Invercargill, New Zealand, with two brothers, Andrew and John. His father, Russell Beck, was a museum and art gallery director and gemologist, and his mother was a teacher. Russell wasn't just any museum director. He was a polymath who built telescopes, studied jade from around the world, and had once attempted to build his own rocket in the 1950s. Russell was also a rocket enthusiast who began by building a meter-long missile in the mid-1950s, using engineering equipment from his father's garage workshop. Instead of firing skywards, the rocket blew up, creating a crater on the banks of the Orbital River in Southland. Young Peter inherited his father's obsession with space, but channeled it differently. As a teenager, he spent time turbocharging an old Mini and launching water rockets. While his classmates were studying for university entrance exams, Beck was in the garage pushing the limits of whatever machinery he could get his hands on. The family Mini became his first serious engineering project. He didn't just fix it up. He completely rebuilt it with a turbocharger, transforming a modest family car into something that could compete with sports cars. Beck did not attend university. In 1995, Beck became a tool and die maker apprentice at company Fisher and Paykel. This decision would prove pivotal. Fisher and Paykel, New Zealand's appliance manufacturing giant, gave the 17-year-old Beck something no university could offer: unlimited access to industrial machinery and the freedom to experiment after hours. While working there, he taught himself and used the company workshop to experiment with rockets and propellants. Using these tools and materials, he created a rocket bike, rocket-attached scooter, and a jetpack. The rocket bike became legendary within Fisher and Paykel. Beck would demonstrate it to company executives, strapping a rocket engine to a bicycle and tearing across the parking lot in a trail of smoke and flame. Management, rather than firing him for these dangerous experiments, encouraged his creativity. They saw something in this kid from Invercargill, an engineer who thought from first principles, who could build anything he could imagine. He later worked at Industrial Research Limited between 2001 and 2006, working on smart materials, composites, and superconductors. While working there, he met Stephen Tyndall, who later became an early investor at Rocket Lab. Tyndall, founder of the Warehouse, New Zealand's equivalent of Walmart, would become crucial to Beck's future ambitions. But in 2006, Beck wasn't thinking about investors or business plans. He was thinking about rockets, and he needed to see what the Americans were doing. The 2006 trip to the United States was meant to be Beck's entry point into the global aerospace industry. Beck accompanied his wife, Karen, during her month-long work trip to the United States. While Karen worked, Beck traveled across the country, reconnecting with contacts he had built over the years. He met with people from NASA, Lockheed Martin, and a number of other organizations, as well as Kai Michelson, nicknamed Rocket Man, the first civilian to send a rocket into space. But the rejections piled up. No degree meant no internship. Foreign national meant no security clearance. Portfolio of homemade rockets meant, at best, polite interest before being shown the door. Yet Beck saw something others missed. The entire industry was focused on big rockets for big satellites. SpaceX, founded just 4 years earlier, was developing the Falcon 1 to carry over 1,000 pounds to orbit. But technology was rapidly miniaturizing satellites. What once required a bus-sized spacecraft could now fit in a shoebox. These small satellites needed dedicated rides to specific orbits, not expensive ride shares on massive rockets going to the wrong place. The conversations and the spirit that these individuals shared, that anything was achievable, had a profound effect on Beck. Back in New Zealand, he was fueled with the energy and determination to launch his own company. In an interview with Metro Mag Ends, Beck said, "When I came back, I said, right, I'm going to start the ATIA, Space in Maori program, build suborbital rockets, and go into space." The absurdity of the proposition cannot be overstated. New Zealand had no space industry. Beck had no formal qualifications. The country's venture capital scene was virtually non-existent. Starting a rocket company from Auckland would be like starting a surf brand from Switzerland. But Beck had one advantage. He thought the entire industry had it backwards. Instead of making rockets bigger, make them smaller, cheaper, more frequent. Instead of launching from crowded spaceports, find somewhere remote with clear southern skies. Instead of following the established playbook, write a new one. This contrarian thinking would define everything that followed. From 3D printing rocket engines when everyone said it was impossible, to launching from a sheep farm when everyone said you needed Cape Canaveral, to going public via SPAC when everyone said space companies couldn't generate returns. The kid who couldn't get an internship was about to show the industry what they'd missed. SpaceX, Auckland Airport. Peter Beck stepped off the plane from California with nothing to show for his rocket pilgrimage except rejection letters and a napkin covered in sketches. The company was founded in June 2006 by Peter Beck in New Zealand after a trip to the United States. While contacting potential investors, Beck met New Zealand internet entrepreneur Mark Rocket, later becoming a key seed investor to Rocket Lab. The name alone seemed like destiny. Mark Rocket investing in a rocket company. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. Finding Mark Rocket changed everything. Here was someone who understood that New Zealand's isolation could be an advantage, not a liability. Rocket operated in the nascent internet economy and recognized patterns. Disruption didn't come from the center, it came from the edges. While contacting potential investors, he met Mark Rocket, who later became a seed investor and was co-director from 2007 to 2011. Among other early investors into Rocket Lab was Stephen Tyndall, Vinod Khosla, and the New Zealand government. The early investor meetings were exercises in managing disbelief. Beck would walk into rooms full of skeptical faces and explain that he wanted to build rockets in a country with zero aerospace industry, launch them from sheep farms, and somehow compete with American giants backed by billions in government contracts. The pitch deck from 2007 seems almost quaint now. Hand-drawn rocket schematics, optimistic timelines, cost projections that everyone assumed were off by at least an order of magnitude. But Beck had one advantage. He could actually build things. While other space startups spent years in PowerPoint purgatory, Beck was in his garage welding tanks and testing engines. By 2008, he had a working prototype of the ATIA-1, a suborbital sounding rocket that would prove New Zealand could reach space. The rocket was modest, 6 meters long, 15 centimeters in diameter, designed to carry just 2 kilograms to 120 kilometers altitude. But it was real, tangible proof that Beck wasn't just another dreamer with a space fantasy. The launch site selection embodied everything unconventional about Rocket Lab's approach. The launch took place off the coast of New Zealand from the private island, Great Mercury Island, of Michael Fay, a New Zealand banker and Rocket Lab investor. Michael Fay, the billionaire banker who owned Great Mercury Island, offered his private paradise as a launch pad. While NASA spent billions on Cape Canaveral infrastructure, Rocket Lab would launch from a privately owned island accessible only by boat or helicopter, with sheep as the primary inhabitants. November 30th, 2009, became New Zealand's entry into the space age. ATIA-1, named Manu Karere, or Bird Messenger by the local Maori iwi, was successfully launched from Great Mercury Island near Coromandel Peninsula on 30th November 2009 at 0123 UTC, 1423 local time. The launch almost didn't happen. Fuel system problems delayed the morning launch to past midnight, and at one point, a $6 hardware store part saved the entire mission. 3 years later, in November 2009, Rocket Lab successfully launched the multi-stage rocket ATIA-1, becoming the first private company in the Southern Hemisphere to reach space. The rocket soared into the night sky, tracked by GPS uplink to the Inmarsat satellite constellation. It reached space, crossing the Kármán line at 100 kilometers, before splashing down 50 kilometers offshore. The payload was not recovered, and the launch was deemed unsuccessful. The payload was a ballistic instrumentation dart, and its trajectory depended only on the boost phase. But recovery wasn't the point. The point was that a tiny team from New Zealand had done what only governments and massive corporations had done before. The success caught the attention of the U.S. government. In December 2010, the company was awarded a U.S. government contract from the Operationally Responsive Space Office, ORS, to study a low-cost space launcher to place CubeSats into orbit. The Operationally Responsive Space Office, a Pentagon initiative focused on rapid space capability deployment, saw potential in Rocket Lab's lean approach. The contract was modest but symbolically massive. The U.S. military was betting on a New Zealand startup. This period also saw Rocket Lab begin developing relationships that would prove crucial. Vinod Khosla, the legendary venture capitalist who had backed impossible dreams before, joined as an investor. In 2013, funding was obtained from Khosla Ventures and Callaghan Innovation, a crown entity of New Zealand. Callaghan Innovation, New Zealand's government innovation agency, provided not just funding, but credibility. The company was no longer Beck's garage project. It was becoming a national champion. The decision to move to the United States in 2013 was both inevitable and wrenching. Around 2013, Rocket Lab moved its registration from New Zealand to the United States and opened headquarters in Huntington Beach, California. Around 2013, the company moved to the United States and established its headquarters in Huntington Beach, California. The move coincided with funding from American sources and was in part due to increased U.S. government involvement. The New Zealand company became a subsidiary of the American company. Beck needed access to American capital, American customers, and American technology. But he insisted on keeping manufacturing and launches in New Zealand. The company would be American on paper, but Kiwi in spirit. The move to Huntington Beach put Rocket Lab in the heart of Southern California's aerospace corridor, surrounded by suppliers, engineers, and competitors. Bessemer Venture Partners invested in 2014, and Lockheed Martin invested in 2015. The contrast with Auckland was stark. From isolation to immersion, from outsider to neighbor. But Beck maintained the startup's scrappy culture. While competitors occupied gleaming campuses, Rocket Lab operated from a modest industrial building, every dollar saved going toward rocket development. The early funding rounds tell a story of gradual credibility building. The $5 million Series A from Khosla Ventures in 2013 was followed by larger rounds as the company hit milestones. In 2013, Rocket Lab completed its Series A in a round led by Khosla Ventures, which invested $5.5 million in the deal. Alongside the fundraise, the company headquarters moved from New Zealand to California to begin to develop the Electron rocket. Each round required Beck to sell an impossible vision while showing just enough progress to make it seem possible. When I first started Rocket Lab, I ran around Silicon Valley trying to raise $5 million. At that time, that was an absurd amount of money for a rocket startup. A rocket startup was absurd, in general. It was only SpaceX then. A rocket startup from someone living in New Zealand was even more absurd. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on Beck. Here he was, asking Silicon Valley to fund rockets from a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. But perhaps that absurdity was the point. If you're going to do something impossible, you might as well do it from the most impossible place imaginable. Check, you was die, Bistier. Pitch for Electron in 2013 sounded like science fiction. A rocket with 3D printed engines, powered by batteries, built in days instead of months, launched for $5 million instead of $60 million. Industry veterans rolled their eyes. Electric turbopumps? That violates every principle of rocket engineering. 3D printed combustion chambers? They'll melt on the launch pad. Carbon fiber fuel tanks? One crack and the whole thing explodes. But Beck wasn't constrained by what had been done before. Rocket Lab began development on the world's first 3D printed electric turbopump-fed engine in 2013. Within the same year, Rutherford was test-fired for the first time, marking the beginning of a new generation in rocket propulsion. The Rutherford engine, named after Ernest Rutherford, New Zealand's only Nobel Prize winner in science, represented a complete reimagining of rocket propulsion. The innovation started with the turbopumps. Traditional rocket engines use complex gas generators to drive their fuel pumps, creating a Rube Goldberg machine of plumbing and combustion that adds weight, complexity, and countless failure points. Beck's solution was almost embarrassingly simple. Use electric motors. Instead of being powered by traditional gas turbine pumps, Rutherford uses a cycle of brushless DC electric motors and high-performance lithium polymer batteries to drive its propellant pumps. This cuts down on much of the complex turbo machinery typically required for gas generator cycle engines, meaning that the Rutherford is simpler to build than a traditional engine but still can achieve 90% efficiency. The skeptics had a point. Battery technology in 2010 wouldn't have worked. But by 2013, Tesla's revolution in lithium batteries had changed the equation. The same technology powering electric cars could now power rocket engines if you were brave enough to try. Beck was. The batteries would only need to work for about 160 seconds, the duration of the first stage burn. After that, they could be discarded along with the rest of the stage. 3D printing was the other revolution. With a 3D printed combustion chamber, injectors, pumps, and main propellant valves, Rutherford has the most 3D printed components of any rocket engine in the world. These primary components can be printed in 24 hours, drastically reducing production timelines. While competitors spent months machining a single engine component, Rocket Lab could print an entire engine in 3 days. The electron beam melting process created parts that were actually stronger than traditional castings, with complex internal geometries impossible to achieve through conventional manufacturing. The numbers were staggering. SpaceX's Merlin engine, the gold standard for cost-effective rocket propulsion, took months to build and cost millions. Rutherford could be built in 72 hours for a fraction of the cost. The sea-level version produces 24.9 kN, 5,600 LEF of thrust, and has a specific impulse of 311 s, 3.05 km/s, while the vacuum-optimized version produces 25.8 kN, 5,800 lbf of thrust, and has a specific impulse of 343 s, 3.36 km/s. Not massive thrust, but for small satellites, it was perfect. The rest of Electron followed the same philosophy. Question every assumption. The fuel tanks were made entirely from carbon fiber composite, saving massive weight compared to aluminum. The avionics used automotive-grade components instead of expensive space-rated hardware. The second stage could be 3D printed and assembled in days. Everything was optimized for one goal: get small satellites to orbit cheaply and frequently. Building the rocket was only half the challenge. Rocket Lab needed somewhere to launch it. The obvious choice would have been to lease a pad at an established spaceport, Vandenberg in California, Cape Canaveral in Florida. But that would mean waiting in line behind SpaceX, ULA, and every other launch provider. Beck wanted to launch weekly, not quarterly. The solution was audacious: build their own spaceport. Not in America, but in New Zealand, on a remote peninsula called Mahia. The company broke ground at Mahia in December 2015, and by June 2016, most of the infrastructure work had been completed, including upgrades to roads and internet services, and work was progressing on the electrical, mechanical, and communications infrastructure. The Mahia Peninsula site, named Rocket Lab Launch Complex 1, was officially opened on 26 September 2016, UTC, in a ceremony presided over by Minister for Economic Development Stephen Joyce. It was attended by approximately 240 people, including company employees, local landowners, and then Labor Party leader Andrew Little. Launch Complex 1 was unlike any spaceport ever built. Launch Complex 1 features a 50-ton, 49 long-ton, 55 short-ton, launch platform and tower, a hangar for the Electron rockets, and storage tanks for liquid oxygen and kerosene. No massive vehicle assembly building, no crawlers, no army of technicians. Just the essentials: a pad, a hangar, some fuel tanks, and spectacular isolation. The site could theoretically support a launch every 72 hours, unheard of for an orbital launch facility. The location offered unique advantages. Launching eastward over the Pacific meant no populated areas under the flight path. The southern latitude allowed access to valuable sun-synchronous orbits used by Earth observation satellites. And perhaps most importantly, New Zealand's airspace was empty. No commercial airline routes to redirect, no military restrictions to navigate. By early 2017, everything was ready for Electron's first test flight. The rocket stood on the pad at Mahia, a slender black needle against the New Zealand sky. 9 Rutherford engines clustered at its base, their 3D printed chambers gleaming. The payload was modest, just a test mass, but the stakes were enormous. Years of work, millions in investment, and Beck's entire vision came down to the next few minutes. May 25th, 2017. It's a test. The mission name reflected both honesty and humor. The first test flight took place on 25 May 2017 from Mahia Peninsula, on New Zealand's North Island. After reaching an altitude of about 224 kilometers, 139 meters/hour, the rocket was performing nominally, but telemetry was lost and flight control destroyed it. The rocket reached space but didn't achieve orbit due to a ground equipment failure, a configuration error in third-party telemetry equipment. It was simultaneously a failure and a massive success. The rocket worked. The engines performed flawlessly. Only a ground station glitch prevented orbital insertion. 8 months later, on January 21st, 2018, still testing, lifted off from Mahia. This time, Everything worked. On 21st January 2018, their second rocket, on a flight named Still Testing, launched, reached orbit, and deployed 3 CubeSats for customers Planet Labs and Spire Global. The rocket also carried a satellite payload called Humanity Star, a 1 wide, 3.3 ft, carbon fiber geodesic sphere made of 65 panels that reflect the sun's light. Electron had reached orbit, a rocket with battery-powered 3D printed engines built by a startup from New Zealand had successfully delivered satellites to space. The Humanity Star was Beck's statement of intent, a disco ball in space, visible to the naked eye, reminding everyone on Earth that space was no longer the exclusive domain of superpowers and billionaires. Critics called it space graffiti. Beck called it art. Either way, it got people talking about Rocket Lab. The path from concept to orbit had taken just 4 years and roughly $100 million in development costs. SpaceX had spent $390 million developing Falcon 1. Blue Origin had been working on orbital rockets for over a decade without launching one. Rocket Lab had done it faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible, proving that their approach, questioning every assumption, embracing new technologies, building everything in-house, actually worked. Gico years. November 11, 2018, marked a turning point. The It's Business Time mission wasn't just Rocket Lab's first fully commercial launch. It was the beginning of their transformation from aerospace startup to launch services provider. On 11 November 2018, the first commercial launch, third launch overall, took off from Mahia Peninsula carrying satellites for Spire Global, GeoOptics, a CubeSat built by high school students, and a prototype of a drag sail. The mission deployed 7 satellites, including one built by high school students. The message was clear. Space wasn't just for governments and billionaires anymore. The first NASA mission, launched in 2018, was valued by the space agency at $6.9 million, with launch services, etc. included. The contract value might seem modest compared to the hundreds of millions NASA typically spent on launches, but it represented massive validation. NASA was trusting a New Zealand startup with American government payloads. The regulatory hurdles alone had taken years to navigate. Export controls, technology transfer agreements, security clearances. Beck had to essentially create a firewall within his own company, with American citizens handling certain technologies while Kiwi engineers worked on others. The production challenge was immense. Beck had promised rapid, reliable launches, but building rockets at scale proved harder than building prototypes. The Huntington Beach facility transformed from R&D lab to production line. To meet a growing launch manifest, Rocket Lab has recently expanded its propulsion manufacturing and test teams and also increased its 3D printing facilities in Huntington Beach to produce 200 Rutherford engines in the next 12 months. Every 18 days, a new Electron rolled off the production line, a cadence that would have been considered impossible just years earlier. But success brought new challenges. SpaceX had revolutionized large launch with reusability, landing, and reflying Falcon 9 boosters dozens of times. Investors and customers began asking the obvious question: why was Rocket Lab throwing away perfectly good rockets after each launch? Beck's initial response was dismissive. Electron was too small for propulsive landing. The economics didn't make sense. Reusability was a distraction from reliability. Then SpaceX started offering rideshare missions. For $1 million, small satellites could hitch a ride on Falcon 9. The price was devastating to Electron's business model. Why pay $7 million for a dedicated launch when you could fly for a seventh of the price? The answer was control, choosing your orbit, your schedule, your risk profile. But for many customers, especially cash-strapped startups, the price difference was too large to ignore. In 2018, Rocket Lab began to develop reusable first-stage technology, after previously stating publicly that they had no intention of attempting to recover and reuse their launch vehicles. The about-face was jarring but necessary. Beck realized that without reusability, Electron would be relegated to niche missions where dedicated launch was absolutely essential. The engineering challenge was daunting. How do you recover a rocket that's too small to carry landing fuel? The solution was audacious, even by Rocket Lab standards. Catch it with a helicopter. The Electron first stage would re-enter the atmosphere, deploy a parachute, and be snagged midair by a modified Sikorsky S-92 helicopter before it hit the ocean. It sounded like something from a James Bond movie, not a serious engineering proposal. But the physics worked, barely. The stage would need to survive re-entry without a heat shield, orient itself without control surfaces, deploy parachutes at exactly the right moment, and somehow rendezvous with a helicopter in a vast expanse of ocean. Years of testing followed. Rocket Lab added instruments to gather re-entry data, tested parachute deployments, practiced helicopter catches with dummy stages. Each launch became an incremental step toward recovery. The company culture shifted. What had been a nice-to-have became existential. Without reusability, Electron couldn't compete. With it, the economics transformed. Long Beach, California, May 2nd, 2022. Rocket Lab, NASDAQ, RKLB. Rocket Lab, or the company. A leading launch and space systems company has successfully launched its 26th Electron mission, deploying 34 satellites to orbit. Rocket Lab has now deployed a total of 146 satellites to orbit with the Electron launch vehicle. The mission name said it all, there and back again. For the first time, Rocket Lab would attempt to catch a returning booster with a helicopter. The execution was nearly flawless. The Electron lifted off from Mahia, deployed its payload, and the first stage began its journey back to Earth. After re-entering the atmosphere, and about 7 minutes after liftoff, the booster deployed a drogue chute at around 13 km, 8.3 miles, followed by the main parachute at 6 kilometers, 3.7 miles. Just over 8 minutes after liftoff, the main chute slowed the vehicle down to 10 meters per second, 22 meters. About 18 minutes after liftoff, the helicopter flew just above the booster and snagged its parachute with a hook. For a moment, it worked perfectly. The helicopter caught the booster. History was made. Then, seconds later, the pilots felt something wrong. Unusual flight characteristics that made the load unsafe. The chopper pilots ended up releasing the booster, as they were not happy with the way it was flying, but no big deal. The rocket splashed down safely and the ship is loading it now, Rocket Lab founder and CEO Peter Beck said via Twitter. The booster was dropped into the ocean and recovered by ship. It was simultaneously a failure and a triumph. The catch had worked. The impossible had been proven possible. The release was a setback, but not a disaster. Beck's response captured the company's pragmatic optimism. No big deal. We'll try again. Bringing a rocket back from space and catching it with a helicopter is something of a supersonic ballet, said Rocket Lab founder and CEO Peter Beck. A tremendous number of factors have to align, and many systems have to work together flawlessly, so I am incredibly proud of the stellar efforts of our recovery team and all of our engineers who made this mission and our first catch a success. The recovery program represented more than just cost savings. It was about manufacturing efficiency. Why build a new rocket when you could refly an old one? It was about learning. Every recovered stage provided data on how components performed under actual flight conditions. And it was about competition, showing the market that Rocket Lab could innovate just as radically as SpaceX. By 2021, Rocket Lab had found its rhythm. Launch cadence increased steadily. 9 launches in 2020, 6 in 2021, despite COVID disruptions. The customer base diversified beyond small satellite operators to include major defense contractors, NASA science missions, and commercial constellation builders. Each successful launch built credibility. Each on-time delivery built trust. The transformation was remarkable. In just 3 years, Rocket Lab had gone from experimental launches to routine operations. They weren't just launching rockets, they were running a space logistics company. The mad dream of a kid from Invercargill had become a critical piece of global space infrastructure. Boy. The boardroom at Vector Capital's San Francisco offices felt like a pressure cooker. March 2021. Peter Beck sat across from Alex Slusky, the SpaceX CEO, negotiating the final terms of what would become one of the most significant space industry deals of the year. In March 2021, the company announced that it was planning to go public through an initial public offering, IPO, of stock in the second quarter of 2021. The company planned to accomplish the IPO through a merger with a special purpose acquisition company, SpaceX, called Vector Acquisition Corporation, VACQ. The SPAC boom of 2020-2021 had created a unique moment in capital markets history. Companies that would normally wait years for an IPO could go public in months. Virgin Galactic had shown the way, merging with social capital head Sophia in 2019. Suddenly, every space company was exploring SPAC options. For Rocket Lab, the timing was perfect. They needed capital for Neutron, and the public markets were hungry for space stocks. The merger planned to value the company at $4.1 billion and provide the company with $790 million in working capital to support the development of a medium-lift, two-stage-to-orbit launch vehicle called Neutron, aiming for the mega constellation satellite deployment market. The valuation represented a massive leap from the company's last private round, a $140 million Series E in 2018 that valued them at just over $1 billion. In less than 3 years, Rocket Lab had quadrupled its valuation. The negotiations were intense. Vector wanted assurances about launch cadence, revenue projections, and the timeline for Neutron. Beck wanted to maintain control and ensure sufficient capital for his ambitious plans. The PIPE, private investment in public equity, round became crucial. Institutional investors like BlackRock and Neuberger Berman needed to validate the deal with real money. In addition, a concurrent private investment in public equity, PIPE round, led by Vector Capital, BlackRock, and Neuberger Berman, will provide $470 million. The projections Beck presented were ambitious but grounded in reality. The company forecasted positive adjusted EBITDA by 2023, positive cash flows by 2024, and over $1 billion in revenue by 2026. For a company that had generated just $33 million in revenue in 2020, these numbers seemed fantastical. But Beck had a secret weapon, the space systems business. While everyone focused on rockets, Rocket Lab was quietly building a vertically integrated space company that could capture value across the entire stack. August 20th, 2021. The shareholder vote was a formality. Less than 3% of Vector's shareholders redeemed their shares, a vote of confidence in the merger. Vector's shareholders approved the merger at an annual general meeting of Vector's shareholders on August 20th, 2021. 5 days later, Rocket Lab began trading on the NASDAQ. The company began trading on the NASDAQ Stock Exchange on 25 August 2021 after merging with SPAC Vector Acquisition at a $4.8 billion valuation. The gross amount of cash that Rocket Lab will receive from Vector's trust account and PIPE financing that closed substantially concurrently with the merger before transaction expenses equals approximately $727 million. The opening bell ceremony at the NASDAQ was surreal for Beck. Standing in Times Square, watching RKLB flash across the screens, the kid from Invercargill who couldn't get a college degree was now CEO of a public company worth nearly $5 billion. At the time, Rocket Lab had over 500 employees, and it had successfully launched 105 satellites into orbit. The transformation from garage startup to public company was complete. But going public brought new pressures. Quarterly earnings calls meant constant scrutiny. Every launch delay triggered stock movements. Every SpaceX announcement prompted investor questions about competition. The freedom to operate in stealth, to fail quietly and iterate quickly, was gone. Everything was now public, measured, analyzed. The capital infusion transformed Rocket Lab's capabilities. Rocket Lab spent somewhere between $250 million to $300 million of the cash gained from going public to develop Neutron. They could now pursue acquisitions aggressively, building out their space systems capabilities through strategic purchases. The public currency of stock also became a powerful tool for attracting talent. Engineers who might have chosen SpaceX or Blue Origin could now be lured with equity that had real, liquid value. The timing proved fortuitous. The SPAC market collapsed shortly after Rocket Lab's merger closed. Companies that went public later faced brutal valuations and high redemption rates. Rocket Lab had caught the last good wave of SPAC enthusiasm, securing capital just before the window closed. Beck's approach to being a public company CEO was characteristically unconventional. While other space CEOs made grand pronouncements about Mars colonies and space tourism, Beck focused on execution and transparency. Earnings calls became tutorials on rocket economics. Investor presentations explained the physics of orbital mechanics. He treated shareholders like intelligent partners, not just sources of capital. The market initially struggled to value Rocket Lab correctly. Was it a launch company? A satellite manufacturer? A space services provider? The answer was all three, but Wall Street liked clean categories. The stock price gyrated wildly in the first months of trading, as investors tried to understand what exactly they had bought. The employee impact was profound. Suddenly, engineers who had joined for the mission found themselves with valuable stock options. The company culture, built on Kiwi pragmatism and startup scrappiness, had to adapt to the realities of being a public company. Compliance, controls, and quarterly targets became part of daily life. Some early employees, suddenly wealthy on paper, left to start their own ventures. Others doubled down, seeing the public listing as just the beginning. We're super excited to bring a high-quality space asset to the market, Rocket Lab CEO Peter Beck told CNBC. The phrase high quality was carefully chosen, a subtle dig at competitors going public with PowerPoints instead of orbital rockets. While other space SPACs promised future capabilities, Rocket Lab was already delivering. They had rockets flying, satellites in orbit, and real revenue. In a market full of speculation, they offered substance. The public listing marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Rocket Lab was no longer a startup. It was an established space company with the capital and credibility to compete with anyone. But with that status came expectations. The market wouldn't tolerate the delays and failures that marked the early years. Every quarter would be judged, every projection scrutinized. The pressure to deliver had never been higher. Kiko. The boardroom in Toronto was modest. Exposed brick walls, a view of the CN Tower, the quiet hum of engineers working in the adjacent lab. March 2020. Doug Sinclair, founder of Sinclair Interplanetary, was about to sell the company he'd built over 2 decades to a New Zealand rocket startup. In March 2020, the company announced that it had acquired Sinclair Interplanetary, a Canadian manufacturer of components for small satellites. The irony wasn't lost on him. His star trackers and reaction wheels had flown on satellites launched by SpaceX, Blue Origin, and dozens of other providers. Now he was joining forces with the scrappy underdog. Beck's vision for space systems went beyond just launching rockets. While everyone focused on the sexy business of sending things to space, Beck saw the real value in what happened once you got there. Satellites needed star trackers to know where they were pointing, reaction wheels to turn, solar panels for power, radios to communicate, software to operate. Each component was typically sourced from different suppliers, creating integration nightmares and finger-pointing when things went wrong. The Sinclair acquisition was the opening move in a broader strategy. More than 90 satellites incorporating Sinclair hardware have been launched to orbit, including Rocket Lab-launched satellites from Astro Digital, ALE, and Black Sky. For an undisclosed sum, industry rumors suggested $30–50 million, Rocket Lab acquired not just products, but expertise. Doug Sinclair and his team had spent 20 years perfecting the art of making satellites point where they needed to point, a harder problem than it sounds when you're tumbling through the vacuum of space at 17,000 miles per hour. The acquisition spree accelerated after going public. In October 2021, the company acquired Advanced Solutions, Inc., ASI, a Colorado-based spacecraft flight software company. ASI brought something crucial: the software brains that made satellites intelligent. Their flight software had operated on over 100 missions, from NASA science satellites to classified military spacecraft. The price wasn't disclosed, but the strategic value was clear. Rocket Lab could now offer not just the hardware, but the software that made it work. In November 2021, the company acquired Planetary Systems Corporation, PSC, a manufacturer of satellite separation systems, for $81.4 million. Separation systems might seem mundane. They're basically the mechanisms that release satellites from rockets, but they're mission critical. A failed separation means a dead satellite and a lawsuit. PSC's Lightband system had a perfect track record across hundreds of deployments. The $81.4 million price tag reflected that reliability premium. The crown jewel came in January 2022. In January 2022, the company acquired Sol Aero, a supplier of space solar power products. SolAero wasn't just any solar panel manufacturer. They made the panels that powered the James Webb Space Telescope, the Mars Ingenuity helicopter, and hundreds of other missions. With more than 1,000 successful missions under their belt, the team at SolAero have enabled trailblazing missions, providing space solar power solutions for the James Webb Space Telescope and missions on Mars, including InSight and Ingenuity. The $80 million acquisition brought 425 employees and decades of expertise in the arcane art of making solar cells that could survive the radiation, temperature swings, and micrometeorite impacts of space. The strategic logic was compelling. As an example, Rocket Lab may not be launching a specific spacecraft with Electron or Neutron, but by supplying solar panels or other components such as star trackers, reaction wheels, flight software, separation systems, we're still able to capture revenue and play a role in the mission. Every satellite launched by any company, even competitors, potentially used Rocket Lab components. It was a hedge against launch market volatility and a way to capture value across the entire space economy. The integration challenges were real but manageable. Each acquired company maintained its identity and leadership. Doug Sinclair still ran Sinclair Interplanetary from Toronto. Brad Clevenger continued leading SolAero from Albuquerque. Beck wasn't trying to create a monolithic corporation, but rather a federation of specialized expertise, united by common ownership and shared resources. The financial impact was immediate. Space Systems revenue, while smaller than launch services, carried much higher margins. A star tracker might sell for $100,000 with 40% gross margins. A complete satellite bus could go for millions. And unlike rockets, which were essentially disposable, spacecraft components could be standardized and mass-produced. Since acquiring Sinclair Interplanetary, Rocket Lab has added 2,700 SQFT of production facilities to the Sinclair Interplanetary facilities in Toronto, Canada, and expanded the team to support higher production volume and enable R&D for new satellite hardware and products. The Photon spacecraft platform became the integration point for all these acquisitions. Built on the heritage of Electron's kickstage, but incorporating Sinclair's attitude control, SolAero's power systems, ASI's software, and PSC's separation mechanisms, Photon was a complete satellite bus that customers could buy off the shelf. Instead of spending years integrating components from dozens of suppliers, customers could get a working spacecraft in months. The ambitions went beyond just supplying components. Rocket Lab began building complete satellites for customers. The Space Development Agency, the Pentagon's new satellite acquisition organization, selected Rocket Lab to build 18 transport layer satellites, a $15 million contract that validated the space system strategy. These weren't just component sales, but complete spacecraft, designed, built, tested, and delivered by Rocket Lab. The vertical integration strategy created interesting dynamics. Rocket Lab now competed with some of its customers, satellite manufacturers who bought Rocket Lab components but competed for the same contracts. It supplied components to satellites that would launch on SpaceX rockets. It built spacecraft that would never fly on Electron. The space systems business had become almost independent of the launch business, generating revenue and profits regardless of launch cadence. By 2024, space systems represented a significant and growing portion of Rocket Lab's revenue, with margins that helped offset the capital-intensive launch business. The acquisition strategy had transformed Rocket Lab from a launch company that happened to make satellites into a space company that happened to launch rockets. The distinction mattered. Investors valued diversified space companies at higher multiples than pure-play launch providers. Beck's vision was becoming reality. An end-to-end space company that could take a customer from concept to orbit to operations. Want to put up a constellation? Rocket Lab could build the satellites, launch them, and operate them. Need a mission to Venus? They could provide the complete package. The acquisitions weren't just about buying revenue or technology, they were about building capability that no one else had. The space systems business also provided strategic flexibility. If launch demand softened, component sales could carry the company. If a competitor emerged in small launch, Rocket Lab could pivot to being their supplier. If satellite technology evolved, they owned the companies driving that evolution. It was a hedge, a growth driver, and a competitive moat all at once. Satu imale quite. The render on the screen looked like something from a science fiction movie. A gleaming silver rocket with stubby landing legs, a pointed nose cone that doubled as a fairing, and proportions that seemed wrong to anyone familiar with traditional rocket design. March 1st, 2021. Peter Beck unveiled Neutron to the world via a YouTube live stream, and the aerospace establishment collectively raised its eyebrows. This wasn't an iteration on Electron. This was Rocket Lab declaring war on the medium lift market. The numbers told the story. 15,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit in expendable configuration, 13,000 kilograms with downrange landing, 8,100 kilograms with return to launch site. These weren't small satellite numbers anymore. Neutron could launch entire constellations, carry astronauts, or deliver massive payloads to geostationary orbit. It was designed to compete directly with SpaceX's Falcon 9, the most successful rocket in history. The timing wasn't accidental. SpaceX's rideshare program was eating into Electron's market from below, while the medium lift market was exploding above. The Pentagon's National Security Space Launch Program alone represented billions in potential contracts. Commercial constellations needed hundreds of launches. And perhaps most importantly, the market was essentially a duopoly, SpaceX and ULA, begging for disruption. Beck's approach to Neutron reflected everything Rocket Lab had learned from Electron. The rocket would use LOX and liquid methane propellant, cleaner, cheaper, and more efficient than kerosene. The entire first stage would be reusable, but unlike Falcon 9's propulsive landing, Neutron would use a suspended start approach, with the second stage hanging inside the first stage's fairing until stage separation. This eliminated the need for a traditional inner stage and reduced parasitic mass. The most radical innovation was the fairing design. Traditional rockets jettison their payload fairings once they reach space, expensive carbon fiber shells that protect satellites during ascent, then fall into the ocean. Neutron's fairing would be part of the first stage, opening like a clamshell to release the second stage and payload, then closing for the return journey. Beck called it the Hungry Hippo design. Simple, reusable, elegant. The engine development program pushed Rocket Lab into new territory. The Archimedes engine would produce 1 meganewton of thrust, 40 times more powerful than Rutherford. 7 Archimedes engines would power the first stage, with a vacuum-optimized version powering the second stage. The company leveraged everything learned from Rutherford: 3D printing, innovative materials, simplified cycles, but at a scale that required new facilities, new test stands, new everything. The Virginia facility transformed from concept to construction site with remarkable speed. At NASA's Wallops Flight Facility on Virginia's eastern shore, Rocket Lab began building a 250,000 square foot manufacturing and operations center. The location was strategic, close to government customers in Washington, with clear launch trajectories over the Atlantic, and away from the congested Florida launch corridor. The facility would eventually produce 1 Neutron per month with room for expansion. The test campaign began in earnest in 2023. The second stage underwent qualification testing that pushed it to its limits: 1.3 million pounds of tensile force, 125% of operating pressure, thermal cycling that simulated the extremes of space. Each test revealed problems that needed solving, delays that pushed timelines, costs that exceeded projections. The originally promised 2024 launch date slipped to 2025, then potentially to 2026. The maritime assets told their own story of ambition. In 2024, Rocket Lab unveiled Return on Investment, a 122-meter former platform supply vessel converted into an autonomous drone ship for catching returning neutron boosters. The name was classic Beck humor, but the engineering was serious. The ship could position itself precisely in the Atlantic, provide a stable landing platform in heavy seas, and return boosters to port for refurbishment. The competitive dynamics around Neutron were fascinating. Blue Origin's New Glenn, in development for over a decade, was still chasing its first launch. Relativity Space had abandoned its small rocket to focus on a larger vehicle. ULA was struggling with Vulcan development and cost overruns. Only SpaceX seemed to have cracked the code on reliable, reusable medium lift. and even they had taken years and billions of dollars to get there. The financial pressure was immense. Rocket Lab had spent between $250 million and $300 million of their SPAC proceeds on Neutron development, with estimates suggesting another $600 million needed to reach operational status. Every quarter, analysts questioned the burn rate, the timeline, the market opportunity. Beck's response was consistent. Neutron wasn't just about launch. It was about enabling Rocket Lab's broader ambitions in spacecraft, constellations, and deep space missions. The National Security Space Launch, NESSL Lane 1 program, became a forcing function. Worth $5.6 billion over 5 years for small to medium lift launches, the program required participants to complete a certification launch by the end of 2025. Missing this deadline meant missing out on potentially hundreds of millions in government contracts. The pressure to deliver wasn't just financial, it was existential. The skeptics had valid points. Neutron was arriving into a market where SpaceX had already achieved remarkable cost efficiencies through reusability and scale. Falcon 9 launched dozens of times per year, spreading fixed costs across a large customer base. Neutron would need to achieve similar reliability and cost structures with a fraction of the flight heritage. The learning curve would be steep and expensive. But Beck saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. Falcon 9 was optimized for large payloads and ISS missions, overkill for many commercial and government customers. Neutron was right-sized for the emerging market of proliferated LEO constellations. Its Virginia launch site offered advantages for certain orbits. And most importantly, customers wanted alternatives to SpaceX, especially government agencies concerned about launch provider diversity. The technical milestones accumulated steadily. Archimedes engine hot fire tests, tank pressure tests, fairing deployment mechanisms, software simulations. Each success built confidence. Each setback taught lessons. The culture at Rocket Lab shifted from the scrappy startup that could build rockets in a garage to a mature organization executing one of the most ambitious development programs in aerospace. By late 2024, Neutron had consumed over 4 years and hundreds of millions in development. The first flight vehicle was taking shape in Virginia, its carbon composite structure a testament to manufacturing innovations that didn't exist when the program started. The question was no longer whether Neutron would fly, but when, and whether it would arrive in time to capture the market opportunity Beck envisioned. L'André-Guidor's small launch market of 2024 looked nothing like Beck's original vision from 2006. What was supposed to be a flowering ecosystem of small satellite operators, each needing dedicated launches, had instead consolidated into a few large constellation operators who preferred bulk launches on big rockets. The very success of companies like SpaceX in reducing launch costs had changed the fundamental economics of the industry. SpaceX's transporter rideshare missions had become the elephant in the room, or rather the falcon in the launch manifest. At roughly $5,000 per kilogram for small satellites, these missions offered prices that Electron couldn't match even with full reusability. The January 2024 Transporter 9 mission carried 90 satellites for dozens of customers. Why would anyone pay $7 million for an Electron launch when they could get a ride on Falcon 9 for under $1 million? Beck's answer was nuanced but compelling. Rideshare was like taking the bus, cheap. But you went where the bus went, when the bus went. Electron was a taxi, more expensive, but you controlled the destination and schedule. For Earth observation companies needing specific sun-synchronous orbits, for defense customers with security requirements, for technology demonstrators needing isolation from other payloads, dedicated launch still made sense. The numbers back this up, albeit imperfectly. Despite rideshare competition, Rocket Lab maintained a healthy manifest, though growth had slowed. The 2024 launch cadence of 16 missions fell short of the projected 22, but the shortfall was due to customer delays rather than lack of demand. The company had proven there was a sustainable niche for dedicated small launch, even if it wasn't the massive market once envisioned. The geographic advantage had proven more valuable than anyone anticipated. New Zealand's isolation, once seen as a liability, had become a strategic asset. The Mahia launch site could access orbits that were difficult or impossible from other locations. The lack of air and marine traffic meant minimal range conflicts. The New Zealand government's pragmatic approach to space regulation, thorough but efficient, contrasted sharply with the bureaucratic morass in other countries. Being the only commercial launch provider operating from New Zealand gave Rocket Lab effective monopoly power in certain scenarios. Sun-synchronous orbits launched from Mahia could achieve optimal lighting conditions for Earth observation satellites. Southern Hemisphere launches could access unique inclinations. Government customers appreciated having a launch option outside the increasingly congested U.S. launch ranges. The Virginia expansion added another dimension. Launch Complex 2 at Wallops offered mid-inclination orbits ideal for many commercial constellations. More importantly, it was a 3-hour drive from Washington, D.C., making it convenient for government customers and contractors. While SpaceX and ULA fought for pad time at Cape Canaveral, Rocket Lab had essentially exclusive access to a premier East Coast launch facility. The competitive landscape was littered with casualties. Virgin Orbit, despite Richard Branson's backing, and Boeing 747 launch platform filed for bankruptcy in 2023. Astra, once valued at $2.6 billion, its stock price collapsed after multiple launch failures and pivoted away from launch entirely. Relativity Space abandoned its 3D printed Terran 1 small rocket before achieving orbit. The small launch market had proven brutal for everyone except Rocket Lab. Blue Origin remained the enigma. Jeff Bezos' space company had unlimited funding and impressive facilities, but couldn't seem to convert resources into results. New Glenn, originally supposed to launch in 2020, kept slipping. Their BE-4 engines, critical for ULA's Vulcan rocket, were years behind schedule. Every Blue Origin delay was an opportunity for Rocket Lab to establish itself in the medium lift market before serious competition arrived. The international dimension added complexity. Chinese companies like iSpace and Galactic Energy were developing small launchers with government backing and protected domestic markets. European efforts through Arianespace focused on larger vehicles. Indian space startups were emerging, but years from operational capability. Japan's small launch efforts had struggled with reliability. Rocket Lab's first-mover advantage in the Western small launch market seemed secure for the near term. Rocket Lab's true differentiation came from vertical integration. While competitors focused solely on launch, Rocket Lab could offer complete mission solutions. A customer could come with just an idea and leave with a satellite built, launched, and operated by Rocket Lab. This end-to-end capability created stickiness. Customers who bought satellites often bought launches and vice versa. The company's success rate spoke volumes. With over 50 successful Electron launches and only 3 failures, all in the early development phase, Rocket Lab had achieved the highest success rate of any orbital rocket in its first 50 flights. This reliability premium mattered enormously for customers launching expensive, one-of-a-kind satellites. Insurance rates for Electron were now comparable to much more established vehicles. The dual hemisphere operations created unique advantages. When weather delayed launches at Mahia, Wallops might be clear, and vice versa. Different sites could specialize in different orbit types. The ability to launch from either location gave customers flexibility that no other small launch provider could match. It also provided redundancy, a critical consideration for government customers worried about single points of failure. Market positioning had evolved from cheap launches for small satellites to responsive, reliable access to any orbit. The U.S. Space Force's Tactically Responsive Space Program valued the ability to launch on short notice more than raw cost per kilogram. Commercial Earth observation companies needed specific orbital planes more than cheap rides. Technology demonstrators needed dedicated launches to avoid contamination from other payloads. The financial markets were beginning to understand this nuanced position. While Rocket Lab would never match SpaceX's launch volume, it didn't need to. Like Southwest Airlines competing with United and American, Rocket Lab had found profitable niches that larger competitors couldn't or wouldn't serve. The question wasn't whether Rocket Lab could survive. It was how large and profitable those niches could become. So our knighting ceremony at Government House in Wellington was quintessentially Kiwi, formal but not stuffy, proud but not boastful. May 2024. Peter Beck, wearing a morning suit that looked slightly uncomfortable on his engineer's frame, knelt before the Governor General to receive one of New Zealand's highest honors. I don't think anyone ever grows up in Invercargill thinking that they're going to meet the Queen or the King and get a knighthood, he said in an interview with One News. Sir Peter Beck, it still sounded surreal to him. The honor recognized not just business success, but Beck's contribution to establishing New Zealand as a spacefaring nation. From zero space industry in 2006 to the world's fourth most frequent launcher of orbital rockets by 2024, Beck had transformed his country's relationship with space. The kid who couldn't get an internship at NASA had made New Zealand a space power. Beck's leadership philosophy was shaped by his working-class background and practical engineering mindset. We don't have a pool table, and we don't have a corporate jet. We have a rocket, he often said, capturing the company's ruthless focus on mission over perks. While Silicon Valley startups offered lavish benefits to attract talent, Rocket Lab offered something different: the chance to build actual rockets that went to actual space. The company mission, "We open access to space to improve life on Earth," wasn't just corporate speak. Beck genuinely believed that space technology could solve terrestrial problems. Earth observation satellites could track illegal fishing, monitor deforestation, predict crop yields. Communication satellites could bring internet to remote communities. Science missions could help understand climate change. Every launch enabled capabilities that made life better for someone, somewhere. The culture Beck built reflected New Zealand's national character: innovative but practical, ambitious but humble, serious but not self-important. The number 8 wire mentality, named after a gauge of fencing wire that Kiwi farmers traditionally used to fix everything, permeated the company. Engineers were encouraged to find simple solutions to complex problems, to build rather than buy, to test rather than theorize. Age demographics told an interesting story. The average Rocket Lab employee was around 30, old enough to have experience, but young enough to believe anything was possible. Beck deliberately mixed graybeards with decades of aerospace experience with recent graduates who didn't know what was impossible. The tension between wisdom and naivety created innovation. Veterans kept the youngsters from repeating known mistakes. Youngsters kept the veterans from accepting unnecessary constraints. The management philosophy was distinctly non-hierarchical. Beck's office at the Huntington Beach headquarters was a modest corner room, notable mainly for the rocket components scattered across every surface. He regularly worked on the factory floor, getting his hands dirty with assembly problems. Engineers could and did challenge his ideas. The best idea won, regardless of whose it was. The pressure was immense, and Beck didn't hide it. The rocket that we're launching has satellite operators as customers. And those satellite operators have employees. And those employees have mortgages. And I have employees, and my employees have mortgages, he explained. Every launch carried not just satellites, but livelihoods. Every failure meant letting down not just customers, but families. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but Beck believed acknowledging it made everyone better. Beck's approach to risk was paradoxical. Extraordinarily conservative in some areas, radically aggressive in others. Every component was tested beyond destruction. Every procedure had backups. Every launch decision erred on the side of caution. But strategically, Beck took massive gambles, building rockets in New Zealand, going public via SpaceX, betting everything on Neutron. The key was knowing which risks were engineering problems that could be solved with diligence and which were market opportunities that required boldness. The work-life balance, or lack thereof, was legendary. During Electron development, Beck regularly slept at the factory. Even after going public, 80-hour weeks were common during critical phases. But this wasn't mandated or even explicitly encouraged. It was contagious. When employees saw the CEO debugging battery management software at 2 a.m., they wanted to match that commitment. The mission mattered more than the hours. Communication style set the tone. Beck's emails were famous for their brevity and clarity. Technical discussions were brutally honest. Bad ideas were killed quickly. Good ideas were implemented immediately. Public communications mixed technical depth with accessibility. Beck could explain orbital mechanics to Congress and rocket engines to kindergartners with equal effectiveness. The philosophy on failure was nuanced. If you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough, Beck would say. But he distinguished between acceptable and unacceptable failures. Blowing up an engine during testing? Good. You learned the limits. Launching with known defects? Unacceptable. The culture encouraged aggressive testing and conservative operations, pushing boundaries in development but not in deployment. International expansion brought cultural challenges. American employees expected different compensation structures than Kiwis. The Toronto team from Sinclair Interplanetary had their own culture. The Solero acquisition brought hundreds of employees with decades of traditional aerospace experience. Beck's solution was federation rather than assimilation. Maintain local cultures while building shared mission and values. The Peter Beck mythology grew with each success. Stories circulated of him personally debugging flight software hours before launch, of designing critical components on napkins during flights, of remembering obscure technical details from years-old tests. Some were true, some embellished, but all reinforced the image of a leader who was engineer first, executive second. Same effort to run a $1 million business as a $1 billion business, so I might as well think a bit bigger, Beck explained his ambitions. This wasn't about ego or wealth. Beck's 10% stake in Rocket Lab was worth over $1 billion on paper, but he showed little interest in the trappings of wealth. It was about impact. If you're going to dedicate your life to something, make it matter. The leadership transition challenges loomed as the company grew. Beck couldn't personally oversee every technical decision anymore. Middle management layers emerged. Bureaucracy crept in. The challenge was maintaining startup agility at public company scale. Beck's solution was radical delegation with clear accountability. Give smart people resources and responsibility, then get out of their way unless they needed help. Numbers on the screen told a story of growth and burn, promise and peril. Q3 2024 earnings call. Peter Beck faced analysts with his characteristic directness. Record revenue of $105 million for the quarter, but still burning cash as Neutron development consumed resources. The stock market's reaction was predictable. Initial enthusiasm followed by concern about profitability timelines. The revenue trajectory was undeniably impressive. From $33 million in 2020 to an expected $400+ million run rate, by late 2024, Rocket Lab had achieved growth rates that most companies only dream about. But the composition of that revenue was evolving in unexpected ways. Launch services, once projected to dominate, had grown more slowly than anticipated. Space systems, initially seen as supplementary, was becoming the growth engine. The unit economics of Electron had improved dramatically but remained challenging. Each launch generated roughly $7 to $8 million in revenue against costs that had dropped from over $10 million in early missions to around $5 to $6 million by 2024. Gross margins were finally positive, but barely. The promised economics of reusability, sub-$5 million costs per launch, remained elusive as recovery operations proved more complex than modeled. Space systems told a different story. Gross margins exceeded 30%, sometimes reaching 40% for high-value components. A single large satellite contract could generate $100 million in revenue with minimal capital expenditure. The acquisition strategy had paid off. Rocket Lab was capturing value across the space economy, not just at the launch segment. The balance sheet reflected the capital intensity of the business. Property, plant, and equipment had ballooned to over $400 million as Rocket Lab built out Virginia facilities, expanded New Zealand operations, and tooled up for Neutron production. Working capital needs grew with the business. Satellites required long lead components, launches needed propellant and batteries, everything needed inventory. Cash burn remained the elephant in the room. Despite revenue growth, Rocket Lab consumed $70 million per quarter in operating and capital expenses. The SPAC proceeds were depleting steadily. At current burn rates, the company had perhaps 18 to 24 months of runway without additional capital. The race was on. Could Neutron reach revenue generation before the money ran out? The market's valuation reflected this uncertainty. Trading at roughly 20 or 30x forward price to sales, Rocket Lab commanded a premium multiple that assumed successful neutron development and significant market share capture. Any delays or technical failures would trigger violent repricing. The stock's volatility, often moving 10 to 15% on routine news, showed how delicately balanced investor sentiment remained. Government contracts provided some stability. The Space Development Agency satellite contracts alone represented over $500 million in backlog. NASA and Space Force awards added hundreds of millions more. Unlike commercial customers who might delay or cancel, government contracts typically proceeded regardless of economic conditions. This baseload revenue helped offset the volatility in commercial launch demand. The competitive dynamics around pricing were fascinating. SpaceX, with its massive scale and reusability, could theoretically price Rocket Lab out of the market. But they didn't, maintaining Falcon 9 prices at levels that provided hefty margins. This pricing umbrella allowed Rocket Lab to remain competitive while working toward better economics. The question was whether SpaceX would maintain this discipline or eventually use price as a competitive weapon. International revenue streams were growing but complicated. Launch contracts denominated in dollars but with costs in New Zealand, dollars created foreign exchange exposure. European customers paid in euros, adding another currency layer. The company's natural hedge, New Zealand costs offsetting New Zealand revenue, only worked partially. Currency movements could swing quarterly results by millions. The investment thesis had evolved since the SPAC merger. Originally pitched as a high-growth launch company riding the small satellite wave, Rocket Lab had morphed into something more complex, a diversified space services company with multiple revenue streams and a major development program. This made it harder to value, but potentially more valuable if all pieces came together. Analyst coverage reflected this complexity. Bull cases pointed to the total addressable market. Hundreds of billions in government space spending, thousands of satellites needing launch, deep space missions requiring specialized capabilities. Price targets reached 20 to 30 pounds per share, implying a $12–15 billion valuation. The logic was compelling if you believed in space economy growth and Rocket Lab's ability to capture share. Bear cases were equally convincing. SpaceX dominance seemed insurmountable. Neutron delays could trigger a financing crisis. Competition from Blue Origin, Chinese companies, or new entrants could fragment the market. Customer concentration, top 10 customers representing over 60% of revenue, created vulnerability. Price targets as low as $5 implied the company was worth little more than its tangible assets. The options market told its own story. Implied volatility often exceeded 80%, reflecting radical uncertainty about outcomes. Call options were expensive, suggesting upside potential. Put options were equally pricey, indicating downside fear. The market couldn't decide if Rocket Lab was the next Tesla or the next Virgin Orbit. Capital allocation decisions would determine everything. Should Rocket Lab raise equity now at dilutive prices, or wait hoping for better valuations? Should they slow neutron development to preserve cash, or accelerate to capture market windows? Should they pursue more acquisitions, or focus on integration? Each choice had profound implications for shareholders. The fundamental question for investors was timing. Rocket Lab had proven it could execute technically. Electron worked, satellites flew, customers paid. But could it achieve profitability before running out of money? The company projected EBITDA positive operations by 2026, free cash flow by 2027. If correct, early investors would be richly rewarded. If wrong, dilution or worse awaited. Chawa doors. Mission patch on Beck's desk showed Venus, Earth's evil twin, shrouded in sulfuric acid clouds that might, just might, harbor life. The Venus Life Finder mission, planned for 2025, embodied everything audacious about Rocket Lab's future ambitions. Using electron and photon, they would send a probe to another planet for under $10 million, a mission NASA would spend billions on. The near-term roadmap was crystallizing with unusual clarity for a space company. Neutron's debut, targeted for mid to late 2025, would unlock the medium lift market. The NSSL on-ramp deadline forced discipline. launch by December 2025, or miss out on billions in government contracts. The pressure was immense but focusing. Every decision was filtered through one question: does this help us launch Neutron on time? The constellation ambitions were becoming more concrete. Rocket Lab wasn't just building satellites for others. They were exploring their own constellation for maritime domain awareness. The business case was compelling. Leverage internal satellite manufacturing, launch at cost on Electron or Neutron, sell data services to governments and commercial customers. Vertical integration would provide cost advantages no competitor could match. Human spaceflight remained deliberately distant, but not dismissed. Never say never, Beck would respond when asked about carrying astronauts. Neutron was being designed with human rating in mind: abort systems, trajectory analysis, safety margins. But the focus remained cargo. Let SpaceX and Blue Origin fight over space tourists. Rocket Lab would move the equipment and supplies that made human presence in space sustainable. The deep space missions represented the most exciting frontier. Beyond Venus, Rocket Lab was proposing missions to Mars, asteroids, even the outer planets. The Photon platform could be adapted for interplanetary crews, carrying scientific instruments or technology demonstrators. Each mission would be a fraction of traditional costs, enabling universities and smaller nations to conduct planetary science. NASA contracts were evolving from customer to partner. The Mars sample return mission would require multiple launches and complex spacecraft. NASA's capstone lunar mission had already demonstrated Rocket Lab's deep space capabilities. Future contracts might include lunar landers, Mars communication relays, asteroid mining precursors. The agency that once rejected Beck's internship application now saw Rocket Lab as essential to its exploration architecture. The software and data services layer was quietly being built. Every Rocket Lab satellite generated telemetry. Every launch produced trajectory data. Every mission created operational expertise. This information had value beyond the immediate mission. Rocket Lab was exploring data productization, selling insights from their constellation, offering mission planning software, licensing their flight software to other operators. Manufacturing innovation continued behind the scenes. The next generation of 3D printing could produce entire rocket sections, not just engines. Carbon fiber technology from Electron was being adapted for Neutron and spacecraft. Battery technology developed for electric turbopumps had applications in satellite power systems. Each innovation created intellectual property and competitive advantages. The geographic expansion possibilities were intriguing. Scotland's proposed spaceport could give Rocket Lab a European launch site. Australian launch facilities would provide access to equatorial orbits. Japan had expressed interest in hosting Rocket Lab operations. Each new site would expand addressable markets and provide redundancy against geopolitical risks. Partnerships were multiplying in unexpected directions. Automotive companies wanted Rocket Lab's expertise in lightweight structures. Energy companies were interested in space-based solar power. Telecommunications giants needed satellite deployment capabilities. Each partnership brought revenue, expertise, and market opportunities that pure-play space companies couldn't access. The long-term vision Beck articulated was profound, democratizing space access to enable global change. Imagine every nation, regardless of wealth, able to launch Earth observation satellites to monitor their resources. Imagine universities conducting planetary science missions on graduate student budgets. Imagine real-time global connectivity enabling education and commerce everywhere. These weren't just dreams, they were engineering problems with solvable solutions. The competitive strategy for this future was subtle but powerful. While SpaceX pursued Mars colonies and Starlink dominance, Rocket Lab would enable everyone else's space ambitions. They would be the picks and shovels of the space gold rush, essential infrastructure that everyone needed regardless of their specific goals. It was less glamorous than Mars, but potentially more profitable. Risk mitigation was built into the strategy. Multiple revenue streams, launch, satellites, components, services, provided resilience. Geographic diversity, New Zealand, United States, potentially Europe, reduced regulatory risk. Customer diversity, commercial, government, international, prevented dependence. Technology diversity, small lift, medium lift, spacecraft, software, created options. The timeline stretched but remained grounded. 2025, Neutron debut, Venus mission, constellation deployment beginning. 2026, NSSL missions, human rating studies, profitable operations. 2027, regular Neutron cadence, deep space missions, potential IPO for Space Systems Division. 2030, Mars missions, lunar economy participation, $2+ billion revenue. Ambitious but not impossible. The transformation would be cultural as much as technical. Rocket Lab would evolve from scrappy startup to space infrastructure company. The company that started in a garage would become essential to humanity's expansion beyond Earth. The college dropout from Invercargill would be remembered not just for building rockets, but for building the foundation of the space economy. Beck's philosophy remained constant through this evolution. If you're not making stuff, you're not adding value. While competitors made presentations, Rocket Lab made rockets. While others promised, Rocket Lab delivered. The future would be built not by those who talked about space, but by those who actually went there. Chakril. The transformation of space from government monopoly to commercial marketplace represents one of the most profound shifts in human capability since the internet revolution. Standing at the Mahia launch complex, watching an electron rise on a pillar of flame, you're witnessing more than just a rocket launch. You're seeing the democratization of the final frontier. Consider the historical context. For decades, space was the exclusive domain of superpowers. The United States and Soviet Union spent hundreds of billions proving ideological superiority through technological achievement. Launching anything required government approval, massive infrastructure, and budgets that only nations could afford. A satellite cost hundreds of millions. A launch cost even more. Space was for the few, the powerful, the connected. Rocket Lab shattered this paradigm. Today, a high school in New Zealand can build and launch a CubeSat. A startup in Ghana can deploy Earth observation satellites. A university in Brazil can send experiments to orbit. The cost hasn't just decreased, it's collapsed by orders of magnitude. What once required the resources of nations now needs only the ambition of individuals. The implications ripple through every industry. Agriculture uses satellite data to optimize irrigation and predict yields. Logistics companies track shipments globally in real time. Climate scientists monitor ice sheets and deforestation with unprecedented precision. Disaster response agencies coordinate relief efforts using space-based communications. None of this was economically feasible when launches cost $100 million. National security has been fundamentally altered. The U.S. Space Force's embrace of commercial providers like Rocket Lab represents a strategic shift from exquisite, expensive satellites to proliferated, resilient constellations. Instead of $1 billion satellite that enemies could target, deploy hundreds of smaller satellites that provide redundancy through quantity. This architectural change, enabled by cheap launch, makes space assets both more capable and more survivable. The economic multiplier effects are just beginning. Every Rocket Lab employee supports multiple jobs in the supply chain. Every launch enables services that create their own employment. Every satellite deployed generates data that drives decision-making across industries. The space economy, projected to exceed $1 trillion by 2040, isn't just about rockets and satellites. It's about the terrestrial activities they enable. For entrepreneurs, Rocket Lab's journey offers profound lessons. Peter Beck started with no degree, no connections, and no space industry in his country. He succeeded through relentless focus on solving real problems, rather than impressive ones. While others pursued Mars colonies and space tourism, sexy but speculative markets, Beck focused on the mundane but essential business of getting small things to orbit cheaply. The capital efficiency lesson is equally important. Rocket Lab reached orbit for roughly $100 million in development costs. Blue Origin has spent billions without achieving orbit. Virgin Orbit spent hundreds of millions before bankruptcy. The difference? Rocket Lab built minimum viable products, tested aggressively, and iterated rapidly. They didn't try to perfect designs in simulation. They built, flew, and learned. The vertical integration strategy challenges traditional business school wisdom about focus. By controlling everything from engines to software, Rocket Lab captured value across the stack while maintaining quality and schedule control. This approach requires more capital and complexity, but creates competitive moats and customer lock-in that pure-play providers can't match. For investors, Rocket Lab represents a fascinating study in market evolution and company transformation. The original investment thesis, small satellite launch, proved smaller than expected. But the company's ability to pivot toward space systems, medium lift, and services demonstrated the adaptability that separates winners from casualties. The best companies don't just execute a plan, they evolve with reality. The valuation puzzle remains unsolved. Is Rocket Lab a launch company that happens to make satellites, or a satellite company that happens to launch? Are they competing with SpaceX or complementing them? Should they be valued on revenue multiples like a growth company or EBITDA multiples like an industrial? The answer determines whether the stock is expensive or cheap, but the market hasn't decided. The broader question is whether space can support multiple winners or will consolidate to monopoly. SpaceX's dominance seems insurmountable. They launch more mass than all other companies combined. But history suggests that markets this large rarely remain monopolies. Airlines, automobiles, computers, all started with dominant players who eventually faced successful competition. Rocket Lab's survival and growth suggests space might follow this pattern. The geopolitical implications extend beyond commercial competition. New Zealand's emergence as a space power through Rocket Lab demonstrates how technology can reshape international relations. Small nations no longer need massive aerospace industries to access space. This democratization could reduce inequality or create new dependencies, depending on how it's managed. For humanity, the significance transcends economics and politics. We're witnessing the opening of a new frontier, not through government programs, but through commercial innovation. The students launching CubeSats today will build the space stations of tomorrow. The data from Rocket Lab-launched satellites will help solve climate change, prevent conflicts, and feed billions. The technologies developed for space will transform life on Earth. Beck's vision of improvement through space access isn't just marketing, it's manifesting. Every launch carries instruments that advance human knowledge or capabilities that enhance human life. The boy from Invercargill who strapped rockets to bicycles has helped create an industry that will shape the next century. Whether Rocket Lab ultimately succeeds or fails as a company, they've already succeeded in proving that space belongs to everyone. The ultimate judgment of Rocket Lab's significance won't come from stock prices or launch statistics, but from what they've enabled. In 20 years, when thousands of satellites monitor Earth's health, when every corner of the planet has broadband, when students routinely conduct experiments in orbit, we'll look back at companies like Rocket Lab as pioneers who made the impossible inevitable. As of late 2024, Rocket Lab stands at an inflection point that will determine whether it becomes a footnote or a foundation stone in the space economy. The recent developments paint a picture of a company racing against time, capital constraints, and competition to establish itself as the definitive alternative to SpaceX. The launch manifest tells a story of steady but slower than promised growth. The company's guidance for 2024 suggested 22 launches, but customer delays and payload readiness issues reduced this to 16. Each postponement costs millions in fixed costs spread across fewer missions, pressuring margins and burning precious cash. Yet the reliability remains exceptional. No failures in recent memory, insurance rates dropping, customer confidence growing. The Neutron development updates have been both encouraging and concerning. The Archimedes engine has achieved full-duration hot-fire tests, validating the fundamental design. The carbon composite structures have passed qualification testing, proving manufacturing techniques. But integration challenges persist. The novel fairing mechanism has required redesigns. The recovery systems need refinement. Each fix costs time and money the company can't spare. The financial markets have been schizophrenic in their assessment. The stock has swung from $4 to $20 and back, driven more by sentiment than fundamentals. Every SpaceX announcement triggers selling. Every government contract triggers buying. The volatility reflects genuine uncertainty about whether Rocket Lab can reach profitability before requiring dilutive financing. Recent contracts provide reasons for optimism. A multi-launch agreement with a confidential commercial constellation operator suggests growing market confidence. The Space Development Agency exercised options for additional satellites, validating the space system strategy. NASA selected Rocket Lab for future Mars mission studies, confirming their deep space capabilities. The competitive landscape has actually improved through attrition. Astra's exit from launch removed a price competitor. Virgin Orbit's bankruptcy eliminated a technical peer. Relativity Space's pivot away from small launch reduced market fragmentation. Blue Origin's continued delays give Rocket Lab potentially years of head start in medium lift. Sometimes the best strategy is simply surviving while competitors self-destruct. The international expansion continues quietly but significantly. Discussions with UK Space Agency about operations from Scotland progress. Japanese partnerships for component supply deepen. European customers increasingly choose Rocket Lab over domestic providers. The company is becoming genuinely global while maintaining its Kiwi core. The acquisition pipeline suggests continued vertical integration ambitions. Industry rumors point to potential targets in spacecraft propulsion, ground systems, and data analytics. Each acquisition would require capital Rocket Lab doesn't have, suggesting either extraordinary confidence in near-term cash generation or preparation for another funding round. The talent war intensifies as the company scales. SpaceX alumni join Rocket Lab seeking smaller company dynamics. Blue Origin engineers migrate seeking actual flight opportunities. University graduates choose Rocket Lab for hands-on experience impossible at larger competitors. But keeping talent requires competitive compensation, straining budgets, and diluting equity. Supply chain management has become a critical differentiator. While competitors struggle with vendor delays, Rocket Lab's vertical integration provides control. Making engines, structures, and avionics in-house insulates from disruptions. This advantage became stark during recent industry-wide helium shortages that grounded competitors while Rocket Lab continued launching. The regulatory environment has evolved favorably. The FAA has streamlined launch licensing for established providers like Rocket Lab. New Zealand's regulatory framework has become a model for other nations. The U.S. government's embrace of commercial space continues strengthening. Each regulatory improvement reduces costs and accelerates timelines. Customer feedback reveals interesting patterns. Government clients praise reliability and security. Commercial operators appreciate schedule control. International customers value the non-American launch option for regulatory reasons. Small satellite operators remain loyal despite SpaceX rideshare options. The customer base is sticky if not growing rapidly. The technology roadmap beyond Neutron hints at continued innovation. Research into nuclear propulsion for deep space missions. Development of inflatable space structures. Experiments with in-space manufacturing. These projects remain largely unfunded but demonstrate the technical ambition that drives the company culture. Strategic options multiply as the company matures. Should Rocket Lab remain independent or seek acquisition by a larger aerospace company? Should they partner with competitors on certain missions? Should they license technology to generate non-dilutive funding? Each path has advocates within the company and investment community. The risk-reward calculation for investors has never been more stark. Success, defined as Neutron flying. Successfully achieving profitability and capturing meaningful market share could generate 10x returns from current valuations. Failure, running out of cash, Neutron delays, or competitive pressure could mean total loss. There's little middle ground in this scenario. The clock is ticking on multiple fronts. The NSL deadline looms, the cash runway shortens, the competitive window narrows, SpaceX grows stronger. Blue Origin might eventually launch. Chinese competitors advance. Every quarter matters in ways that would be manageable for mature companies, but existential for Rocket Lab. After examining every aspect of Rocket Lab's journey, operations, and prospects, we arrive at the fundamental question. Can David truly compete with Goliath? Or is this a compelling story with an unhappy ending? The bear case is straightforward and sobering. SpaceX has won the launch market with economics Rocket Lab can't match. Starship will make Neutron obsolete before it even flies. The cash burn is unsustainable, dilution is inevitable, and the company will either be acquired for parts or slowly marginalized into irrelevance. The small satellite market that justified Electron's existence has evaporated into SpaceX rideshare missions. Blue Origin will eventually deploy Bezos's billions effectively. Chinese competitors with state backing will undercut everyone on price. The space bubble will burst, taking overvalued companies like Rocket Lab with it. The bull case is equally compelling. Rocket Lab has something SpaceX doesn't. Focus on the middle market that's too small for Starship but too important for rideshare. They've built capabilities in spacecraft and components that generate higher margins than launch. The reliability record is exceptional. Customer relationships are strong. The technology is proven. Government support is growing. International expansion provides diversification. Neutron will succeed because Rocket Lab has consistently delivered on technical promises, even if timelines slip. The space economy will grow exponentially, providing room for multiple winners. At current valuations, the risk-reward is asymmetric to the upside. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between these extremes. Rocket Lab has proven it can survive in the most capital-intensive, technically challenging industry humans have created. They've achieved things that seemed impossible, launching orbital rockets from New Zealand, catching boosters with helicopters, sending spacecraft to the moon. They've built real technology, generated real revenue, and created real value. But survival isn't success. The path to profitability remains uncertain. The capital requirements are enormous. The competition is fierce and well-funded. The execution challenges are multiplying as the company scales. Every strength, vertical integration, geographic distribution, technology diversity, is also a complexity that could cause failure. The investment decision ultimately comes down to time frame and risk tolerance. For those believing in the long-term growth of the space economy and Rocket Lab's ability to capture meaningful share, current valuations might represent a generational opportunity. For those focused on near-term profitability and competitive dynamics, the risks outweigh the rewards. What's undeniable is that Rocket Lab has already achieved something remarkable. They've proven that space isn't just for superpowers and billionaires. They've shown that innovation can come from unexpected places. They've demonstrated that questioning assumptions and building from first principles can disrupt established industries. Peter Beck's journey from Invercargill to orbit is more than a business story. It's a testament to human ambition and ingenuity. Whether Rocket Lab ultimately succeeds or fails financially, they've already succeeded in advancing humanity's relationship with space. They've launched students' dreams, enabled scientific discovery, and protected national security. They've inspired a generation of engineers and entrepreneurs to think bigger. The next chapters will be written in launches from Virginia, data from Venus, and decisions in boardrooms. Neutron will fly or it won't. The cash will last or it won't. The market will reward the stock or it won't. But Rocket Lab has already earned its place in space history as the company that proved David could at least compete with Goliath, even if victory remains uncertain. For investors, entrepreneurs, and space enthusiasts, Rocket Lab represents something essential. The possibility that there's more than one path to space, more than one winner in the new space economy, and more than one way to change the world. That possibility alone makes Rocket Lab worth watching, studying, and perhaps even betting on. The rockets will keep rising from Mahia, carrying satellites and dreams in equal measure. Whether they ultimately carry Rocket Lab to profitability or acquisition, to dominance or defeat, remains to be written. But one thing is certain. The kid from Invercargill who strapped rockets to bicycles has already traveled further than anyone imagined possible. The only question now is how much further he can go.